Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to AmeriVet's continued series on adding value to our client base. My name is Michael Naidrich. I'm one of the founding partners here at AmeriVet Securities, and I'm pleased to have Tate Nurkin with us today. Tate, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, of course.
We're excited to hear your thoughts and insights into all things China.
Great.
It's a very exciting, interesting time right now. It's all over the news, and we would just sort of like to get and start to think about some of your thoughts with China and what you're seeing and what you know from your experiences.
Sure, and it's great to be back and great to be here again with AmeriVet Securities. Look, it's obviously a lot going on, and as you mentioned, China is in the news, the trade war is in the news, and I think myself and I think many other analysts were a little bit surprised, not completely surprised, but a little bit surprised at sort of the dramatic turn the trade war negotiations have taken this month. And I think there was a lot of momentum towards and a lot of incentives that were beginning to align that looked like we were going to get to a deal that may not be completely comprehensive, but would at least allow for the continuing positive conversation about how to rebalance U.S.-China economic relations in particular. And by rebalance, I think it's important to note and to keep noting at every opportunity that this is. The administration makes a big deal about the trade imbalance in goods, which is pretty large, but really this is a much deeper issue. It's about how does the United States get China to change some of its trade practices, particularly regarding IP transfer and theft, frankly, as well as how China subsidizes and has other non-tariff trade barriers that affect the competitiveness of its businesses vice those of the United States, favoring China's national champions over U.S. businesses. So what happened? I think a couple of things happened. First, within China, there has been kind of a changing tenor to the debate. We don't think of President Xi as having a really big domestic constituency that he has to appeal to, but there are elites in China, and there certainly are individuals who have watched the negotiations with some trepidation and worry that China and President Xi in particular was going to be bullied by the United States and President Trump. And so I think the debate there is starting to reframe as the negotiations more as a way to punish China rather than rebalance or set a new sort of economic framework for cooperation and economic interaction between the United States and China. So that's certainly one thing, and I think President Trump's tweets and his style in particular, which can be provocative and frequently sent out over social media, has affected that debate. I think also just the general direction of the discussion here in the United States about U.S.-China relations and the U.S.-China strategic competition. I mean, don't forget that it wasn't that long ago that the Department of Defense identified great power, and the national security strategy identified great power competition, and China in particular as the biggest challenge to the U.S. So this discussion about the trade war has some very specific points about IP and about trade imbalances, but it's also must be understood within the context of a much broader U.S.-China competition, which in the U.S. is really now being informed more by national security policy.
A question, so there was, as you were mentioning a little bit earlier, there were some thoughts that we might be making some progress, and sort of the debate was always whether it was going to be a real deal or, the president just making a deal to say he made a deal.
Yeah.
But it seems here in the last 2 weeks that it's really dug in, and you're hearing a lot more talk in general about this being a lengthier process.
Sure.
And if you can just maybe discuss some of the, we see there's been some damage in the markets with technology firms, obviously, and other such companies that are affected by this.
Yeah.
What is some of the effects if this goes on, let's say, leading into the election cycle and some other things?
Sure. Well, I do think the market volatility is an interesting one. I mean, the market plunged 600, 700 points as this news was unfolding, but then it sort of came back a little bit. So I think that the ups and downs of the market may be worrying to some, so that's certainly something to keep an eye on. There are industries that are clearly affected by it. The agricultural industry is at the top of the list. But look, even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a letter signed by shoe manufacturers, some of the biggest shoe manufacturers in the world, to basically an open letter to President Trump and the U.S. administration saying, stop this, because it's really going to hurt American consumers. And some estimates in the letter suggested that they could end up paying 100% tariff on top of for buying shoes. Now, so I think there's some unintended consequences here, but I do think the U.S. is in a slightly better position in this trade war than is China, in large part because China was already going through some economic sort of changes, and the economy was already slowing when this started, and so those systematic challenges with the Chinese economy are being amplified by this particular by the back and forth between the United States and China.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think one of the things that I think about being a student of the markets and listening to these CEOs speak, one of the hardest things for them to digest is obviously uncertainty, right? And I feel like we're getting into a little bit of uncertainty in this battle, and I think that's where you're going to see some nervousness because it's hard to plan when you don't know. And I think that leaving politics aside, because that's a hard thing to get, and getting into an election, I think this is a pretty big moment for the Trump administration to get a meaningful deal. And as we get into November and the Democrats start rallying their cries, there's a lot of people who want them to dig in, and I think there's some people out there that again, maybe not fans of the president, but give him a lot of credit for digging in when times are good, right? The economy's good, the market is good, and he's doing it in good times, because more times than not, people would do this in difficult times, right? And it's just an interesting thing because he's playing the long game, I think, for maybe motivated reasons, right? But how do you kind of look at that, playing the long game and getting maybe a more substantive deal than just a deal?
Yeah, so a couple of points, and I think the first one is, the administration has, I think, taken a very positive step. Whether the trade war was the right move or not, there's plenty of room for debate. But they have remedied the problem of China's trade practices and of some of the economic and national security implications that come with the favoring of Chinese businesses, all the regulations that are placed on U.S. businesses doing business in China, particularly around data accumulation and access, and the IP theft. I mean, these are really big material issues that for a couple of decades, the U.S. has not quite taken as seriously as maybe it should have. And the U.S. intelligence community has been screaming about these issues at increasingly loud volumes for the last certainly the last 5 or 6 years. So I think that's a really good thing, actually, that there is we are now confronting these, and certainly doing it from a position of strength gives us a little bit longer leash, which is really, I think, a very positive thing, and also enables us maybe to play a few of the other cards that we have, because this is, again, it's a strategic competition that is unfolding not just in terms of trade imbalances. The simultaneous and obviously related recent action against Huawei, the executive order, which really was somewhat symbolic, and then putting them on the entity list and denying basically hardware and semiconductors to Huawei is a big deal. Even if it's been delayed by 90 days, it could have a really big impact. So I think, let's give the administration credit for actually confronting China on these issues, which have been materially affecting our economy and our national security. Again, we'll see whether continuing to provoke and continue to raise the ante is the right play, but I certainly think that we're in a stronger position today than a few years ago in terms of relations with China.
That's a good point. And when you see these other meetings happen, like Secretary Mnuchin and sort of the delegates from China, is it possible that the framework of a deal gets done there, or is this something you see is going to happen president to president, and this is sort of like almost like layered management? You let it all out there and you see it happens, and then Trump's going to want to come in, President Trump's going to want to come in and close the deal.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. I mean, I don't think certainly lots of people have been wrong about predictions about the trade war, but I would be surprised if it was one deal. I think that the best outcome, maybe better said, the most likely outcome is that progress gets made, a deal that begins to address some components that allows both President Xi and President Trump to walk away and say, see, here it is, we've won at least this component of the trade war, and that will lead to more discussions about some of the thornier issues, particularly around IP protection, which is critical, obviously, to ultimately resolving the deal. So, yeah, I think those negotiations are things that have to happen at a lower level than president to president,
Right.
but both men want to be seen as being central to resolving this issue, certainly.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way.
Yeah.
So let's talk about tariffs for a second. Tariffs is a heated issue.
Sure.
Some people like them, some people find it strong, other
Yeah.
people are strongly against it.
Yeah.
Is there a benefit, and I know China's sort of your main level expertise, but is there a benefit in President Trump's strategy of tariffs with China with other countries? We saw Canada come to the table just recently, I
Sure.
believe. Is there a sort of a win away from the actual, front that he's fighting with China
Right,
as a
yeah.
result of these tariffs?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, I mean, I personally would have preferred a slightly more gradual approach to the tariffs. Although, to be fair, there was this 90-day pause, which turned into a much longer one, which is why there was so much optimism around a potential deal this month. But yeah, I think one thing that has happened, because the United States is essentially renegotiating all of its major trade agreements at the same time.
Feels like weekly.
Yeah. We've just more or less come through the Mexico and Canada. China clearly is still very uncertain. Japan, the EU, there's still some issues there that need to be resolved and need to be resolved fairly quickly. So I think if tariffs are able to influence those good for the good, that's fine. I'm not sure that they will. Is my ultimate. I think they probably, and I've just recently spoken to people who are looking at this from the European perspective, and I can tell you that they are less convinced that the tariffs are something that will drive them to make any concessions.
Interesting. So here's another thought I was thinking about in preparing for this, nice conversation today. Mm-hmm. We always see the big highlights, and we talk about the technology companies, and we talk about the agricultural industry, and I know President Trump has talked about taking some of those tariffs and redispersing them, and there's some mixed feelings on how that would work or not. Is there any unintended consequences or hidden things that are going on here that aren't making the headlines that could potentially, sneak up on us and we'll go, wow, that was not something we saw that can happen here, or is it pretty much being reported correctly?
I think the reporting has gotten pretty good on the trade war, and I think it's been, it's captured most of the really important tensions and issues and uncertainties. But again, I probably said it more enough in this discussion, but it's worth coming back to that separating the trade war from the other components of U.S.-China relationships and the economic component from, say, the national security or really the tech race that a lot of people are talking about isn't wise. They are all connected, and so levers pulled in one, I think, can have an effect in the other, and I think that's something to keep an eye on if you're looking at risk for different companies. Right. Even if this particular iteration of the trade war gets resolved, there's still a lot going on between these two countries, and the risk doesn't. It may diminish in the short term, but it will be sort of a low level spike, higher level type thing, and so I think that's something always to keep in mind as companies look at the risk of doing business in China or with China. And just overall economic and geopolitical environment.
Understood. So let's switch gears here a little bit. Let's talk about AI.
Sure.
And sort of, I know you have some strong opinions on that and how it affects the future. So if you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Well, I do a lot of work on how a lot of the fourth industrial revolution technologies are affecting national security and defense capabilities in particular. Obviously, all of these technologies, and AI would be at the top of the list, are transforming industry. They're transforming public and private sector activities in the way the public and private sector interact with one another. And certainly that's the case in the national security and defense space, where a lot of the discussion currently is about these sort of surveillance, facial recognition software, and different sorts of ways that AI is being applied to surveil communities. It's interesting, I was at this trade show in Abu Dhabi not too long ago. It was a defense trade show in China. Poly Group, which is one of the state-owned enterprises, had several different versions of facial recognition software on display for export to whomever obviously would be able to buy that. And so that's kind of one area that I think people have expressed ethical concerns about. Lethal autonomous weapon systems is another. Killer robots, sometimes the shorthand there. And there's good reason to have some ethical concerns about those capabilities. Although there's still research to be done on exactly what autonomous platforms and systems look like in the future. But there are a lot more ways that AI is being applied in the national security space, and I think that's an important message for people to understand. It's not just about surveillance and killer robots, it's also being applied to essentially process huge amounts of information that can help make national security communities much more efficient, make better decisions. It's being applied in training and simulation environments so that you get a more realistic picture of how the world actually operates, and your military and security forces are better ready and better able to, again, to make better decisions. It's being applied in logistics and maintenance. It's being applied in terms of better sensing, better being able to collect information better, and to operate in the electromagnetic spectrum more easily. So there's a lot going on here with AI and its different applications, and I think sometimes that gets lost as we just focus on these big picture sort of dystopian uses of it. There's really a lot of very practical, much less ethically challenging sort of areas in which AI is being applied.
So we spoke about this a little bit earlier in our talk, and we were talking like what a deal looks like. And it seems to me that you don't think we're going to get some big, grandiose deal. You think it's going to sort of go in parts, and there'll be small victories. And then if we agree to something, if I think I heard this right, then we can go to the next level and kind of go that route.
I think that is a viable alternative. It's a way to get from where we are now to a much more constructive discussion between the two largest economies in the world and two of the two most powerful militaries in the world, frankly. So that is something that I think is practical, and I think it's worth sort of thinking about that from a business perspective, how that might look. I think the problem with the grand bargain, and I think that what maybe derailed some of it here, is the United States will want enforcement of this. They'll want some transparency of what intellectual property, how are you really doing what you said you're going to do? And there's a history here. President Obama signed a cybersecurity deal with China that we wouldn't go after each other's data, intellectual property, and for 3 or 4 months there was a significant slowdown in the sort of cyber theft and cyber penetration activity that we suspected came from China. But then 6 months later, it was basically back to the same levels, and that's part of the reason why we're here today, is that activity has continued pretty strongly forward. It's not the only way that China acquires technology.
Is it possible that this goes on for years? Can we get into a point where this can get, both sides dig in and maybe to the harm of both sides, or that this gets a little silly?
Well, it's always possible.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't mean that to dismiss the question. It's a great question. I think it's a future that businesses should prepare for. Maybe not as your planning case, but as an alternative scenario, because there are some dynamics here, as we've talked about, that whether the trade war, as it's currently being talked about and understood, ends later this year, this summer, that economic and geopolitical relations between the United States and China will go through peaks and valleys. And so I think that dynamic will persist for some time. It is, of course, possible that the tariffs continue for some time and that becomes the new normal. I would probably bet against that particular future, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be something that businesses and investors shouldn't prepare for and develop hedging strategies around.
So when people talk about the tariffs being an indirect tax on the American consumer, can you give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll qualify by saying that I'm not an economist by trade. Certainly have some thoughts on it, and I've heard some interesting commentary recently about how, because so much of what is taxed, or at least the top 10 items that are being taxed, are actually things that the American consumer can buy from Mexico. Right? So these are there's some things that obviously the U.S. will pay items that the consumer will pay a tax on, but there are others in which the import substitution will take care of that. That seems to me to be a reasonable argument. Although again, I think it's a mixed bag in terms of different types of items that are being imported and taxed.
Sure. So as we sort of wind up here our segment, and Thank you for coming in and giving us your time and your thoughts. Give us your lasting thoughts, your lasting impression where, when we talk about China and tariffs and US-China relations, what's the one thing, and I'm, put you on the spot here a little bit.
Yeah, that's fun.
Give us the one thing that we should be thinking about that we're not being told right now. What is the one thing that, you want us to really be left here with today?
Yeah, the one big thing that I would say, and again, I think the conversation is starting to head this way. I obviously have a perspective on it, is that, look, this is a real competition that is unfolding, and it has real stakes to it between U.S. and China. It doesn't mean that China and the U.S. have to be in conflict with one another. It doesn't mean that every day has to be, a trade war or some, freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea or something like that. But the stakes here are real, and I think that's something that's hard for people to understand, because it's not the future of the free world as it was frequently framed during the Cold War. This is about what comes next in our geopolitical system and whether or not our values will help drive the norms and standards that are set, or whether China's or someone else's will. And I think that's an important conversation for us to have about whether, what degree are we willing to give up the leadership in terms of making the rules. It may be that some people are, but I think it's worth having that conversation.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you frame it the way you frame it, and you put it on a fight over a value system. Yeah. You can understand how this can get deep and messy and confusing relative to just, everyone always, we live in a very soundbite world, right? Where social media, and you read it, you see it. But when you start talking about future moving value system, this might be something that people dig into for a little bit.
Sure, and it's tricky to talk about values, right? Because it's automatically sort of a subjective thing.
Right, sure.
What are those values? I think we could probably identify freedom and individual liberty and things like that. But so it's a tricky conversation, but I think it's an important one to figure out if that is something that we really are, if we're invested in this competition in the way that I think a lot of people feel we should be. And again, the last point I make is that just because there's competition doesn't mean that there's conflict.
Right.
So that's all. It's easy to sort of focus on that competitive dynamic without understanding that there are opportunities here for both sides to come to an agreement on the trade war and on the broader competition that may allow for a peaceful coexistence.
Could there be a solution where it's better for both sides?
Sure. Yeah, of course. Always hold out that hope. I think it will require compromise. Certainly require China to change some of its trade practices, for sure. Probably require a compromise from the United States as well in some areas. But yeah, I think when talking about China, at this point, it's easy to fixate on one component, whether it's the trade war or Huawei, 5G networks, of course, interconnected, or military modernization, or South China Sea island building, or whatever it is. But again, sort of expanding the view and tying those strings and pulling them together and understanding that they're all ultimately related, I think is probably an important takeaway for the folks watching.
Well, we want to just thank you for your time. We'll hope for a good outcome for all sides, especially for the U.S.
Sure.
But your experience from being over there and your years of following this region is most informative to us. We always learn a lot when we sit down. For any of the AmeriVet clients that would like to have a sit down with Tate or meet him or a phone call, we are most available to make that happen for you. We're excited to continue this AmeriVet series, adding value to our client base on a regular basis. Tate, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Great to see you again.